to today's episode of Myeloma Crowd Radio, a show that connects patients with myeloma researchers. I'm your host, Jenny Ahlstrom. We'd like to thank our episode sponsor, Celgene Corporation, for their support of Myeloma Crowd Radio. Today, I'm really excited to have Brian McMahon with us to talk about a very important topic for us as patients. And before I begin, I'd like to share what we've been up to over the last few weeks, and some of you heard this on Friday when we have our little misstep, but I'm going to repeat it for those who haven't. So our family has had a very busy summer. The Myeloma Crowd team and my family personally have been on a 50-city tour across the United States, hosting workshops on a new software tool we have called HealthTree. We've now hosted 36 meetings, and it's been a really amazing experience to sit next to and meet so many of you in so many different situations. Everybody's myeloma experience is really different, and HealthTree is an online tool that really provides three key benefits to patients. First, it helps you understand myeloma treatment options that are relevant to your specific situation. Second, it integrates with Brian's tool, SparkCures, and helps you find clinical trials that apply to you as well. And then we'll be talking a lot more about that today. And then third, it will allow us as patients to really help accelerate a cure for myeloma researchers and allow us as patients to see patterns of responses, care, and help us find ways to live longer with myeloma. So why are we doing this? HealthTree really provides something that no other organization is doing today. This is a data problem, and we don't think it's a problem that can't be overcome with the right technology and the right programs in place. So over 450 patients are now participating in HealthTree, and if you would like us to come to your area, we'd be happy to do that if we're invited in conjunction with a local myeloma support group or a cancer facility. We know that HealthTree will better help you navigate your disease and plan for the future. We've had many patients be very enthusiastic about this tool, and as we've shown the product to myeloma researchers, we're hearing that it will be a helpful tool for them to develop new hypotheses about optimal care for us. So it's really what I wanted when I was diagnosed, and I'd like everybody to have when they're making key decisions at diagnosis and then again at relapse. Now on to our show. I first met Brian McMahon at an ASH conference, and after starting the Myeloma Crowd Radio program, I decided that it was key that we needed to build the tool to help myeloma patients find clinical trials. So we started building a tool with the development team, and I had shown it to some of the myeloma researchers, and they were very excited to have that kind of tool built. After I connected with Brian and he showed me what he had been working on with SparkCures, it was clear that what he had built was really superior to what we were building. So we decided to shut down our project and decided to support what he was doing in every way. His mother had an aggressive form of myeloma, and he had the talent, experience, and motivation to really create something very useful and really needed for patients. So with that, Brian, I will let you give any other introduction you would like, but we welcome you to Myeloma Crowd Radio.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Thanks for the awesome introduction there. And it's amazing. I think it was ASH 2015 when we first connected, if memory serves me right on that, which
yeah,
is
it was a while
hard
ago.
to believe it. Yeah, it's been so long. But I'll tell you, the thing I love about HealthTree, and obviously we're biased. We've been working together for quite some time, and we're big fans of Myeloma Crowd and HealthTree and a lot of the initiatives that, both of us are working on together, but specifically a lot of the stuff that has been spearheaded through the Myeloma Crowd is that it was scratching your own niche, right? This wasn't some sort of theoretical exercise. It was, how can we push this forward, right? Given you said it was the tool I wanted when I was diagnosed, which I think is such a powerful statement. And it reminds me of why we started with SparkCures because, as you mentioned, my mom, when she was diagnosed, she was really an anomaly because she was a nurse, an oncology nurse with over 30 years experience, who at the time was actually on the clinical support team for Amgen. She was on the Neupogen Neulasta team. So not only did my mom have the wherewithal, the understanding of clinical research as a nurse, she had the network through her pharmaceutical and hospital and nurse connections, to really, within 2 weeks of being diagnosed, we were down at the University of Arkansas with Dr. Barloghi and Dr. Tricote, and my mom enrolled in a clinical trial down there. And, that's a very uncommon occurrence when you think about how quickly she moved and was able to get into a clinical trial. So for us, the question was, how do we provide the same level? You shouldn't have to be a 30-plus year nurse to get that sort of access. You shouldn't have to be able to call up Dr. Stan Marks here is the head of the UPMC Cancer Center. She worked with him for a number of years. She called him up, Stan, what are we going to do? People don't have that sort of access. And what we want to do is break those barriers down to really provide that,
very rare.
And sort of scratch that itch. Yeah, exactly. And how could we scratch our own itch, right? I mean, I've gone through this process multiple times with family members. My business partner most recently passed away, and we didn't have the same level of access that we had for my mom. So that was really sort of the genesis of why we wanted to provide this service into really the cancer community, but really niche focused in on multiple myeloma.
Yeah, I think it's really amazing. And her experience is so unusual and so rare. Most of us, I think the statistic is really that 80% of myeloma patients are being diagnosed and starting treatment inside of community oncology centers. And we've talked about this a lot before, but the clinical trial process is so confusing. When I decided, I was planning ahead for relapse, called 8 different clinical trials to say, hey, I'm interested in your clinical trial. I'd like to participate or learn more, and only got a call back from 2. It was really apparent that this system is pretty broken of how to understand the trials and then join the trials, which is why we created this whole Myeloma Crowd Radio program in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate to say, but 2 out of 8 is actually a pretty good hit rate. When we first started, we had even worse numbers than that in terms of actually hearing back when we were calling in for patients. So you're absolutely right, and it's why we need to look at how do we break down these barriers one by one and make this much more approachable for everybody. So that's definitely a big challenge that we're facing is, and if we want, we can kind of go into, we tend to break it down informally here within SparkCures with 3 real barriers. There's a barrier around awareness. We'll get into sort of the details of what that is, but, a lot of patients aren't even aware that a clinical trial is an option, or, what could be even worse is they think that it's an option when there's no other options left, right? I'm not sick enough.
Right,
I haven't gone through all my standard of care options. You
made
a great point there. Exactly. And look, a clinical trial may not be right for someone until then, or they may decide not to go on one till then. But I think for us, what we try to put out there is that a clinical trial should be considered at every change of treatment, at diagnosis, at first relapse, at second relapse, at third relapse, even if you're not going on to that. And we'll talk about why that is, but the clinical trial process is really a continuing shifting landscape of, trials that may or may not be eligible. And it might make sense here to pause for a brief second. And, for anyone that's listening that maybe isn't aware of this, there's what's called inclusion and exclusion criteria. And a lot of people may be familiar with that, but for people who aren't, it's really just a fancy way of saying there's reasons you may be eligible to participate and there's reasons that you won't be eligible to participate. And it could be anything from what's your actual diagnosis, right? So are you MGUS? Are you smoldering? Are you myeloma? Are you high risk, intermediate risk, low risk? How many prior lines of therapy have you had? And what have those prior lines of therapy consisted of? Are all things that can go into sort of these factors. And so at every treatment point, right, every time you have a treatment, some clinical trials may go away forever and never be eligible. You may never be eligible for them ever again. At the same token, at every treatment point or when you have a new treatment, some trials are going to open up for the very first time that you'll now be eligible for. So it's this constantly shifting landscape that makes it really challenging to stay on top of.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get more. Why don't you give us an overview of these 3 different barriers, and then let's jump into the awareness barrier.
Yeah, great. And so the second barrier we really look at is all around understanding. So even if you are aware that clinical trials exist out there, what does it look like? What does it mean? How often are you going to have to travel to a trial? There's high-level expectations, both of the trial and of the patient, that we really want to make clear. And not just that, but how do you go about when there's over 90 treatments in active development for myeloma in the U.S. alone?
Yeah.
How do you go about, even if you're aware of them, how do you understand which one of these is right? Is it an exercise of throwing darts against the wall and sort of whichever one it lands on? There's some real challenges around what this looks like. And it's compounded by, do you have the ability, both the resources and the time and the health to pick up and go somewhere if you're not near a large research center where maybe some of these are? Is it available in your local community setting? Sometimes, not always. So there's an understanding aspect. And then the third, as you hit on earlier, is how do you ultimately take action? Once you can get past the awareness barrier, once you can get past the understanding barrier and you go, okay, here's a trial that I may be interested in, how do you take action, especially if you're calling and no one's returning your phone call, or if you're put into this sort of never-ending, phone mazes that exist out there? What does that look like? So these are really the three things that we wanted to sort of center our conversation around today, and sort of attack those one by one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. That sounds great.
Yeah. Now on the awareness side, if we want to just sort of jump into there, you raised a really great point. You were planning ahead, right? You were looking ahead, and we like to say that the best time to start looking for a clinical trial is when you don't need one.
I agree.
When you have
I
the
completely
energy
agree.
and the wherewithal. And the thing that's nice about that, Jenny, is that if you find something that you're interested in, you can just keep tabs on it. You can watch. You can see as the interim results come out, how well is it working? Did they shut down due to safety concerns? Are they starting to see patients really responding? A potential good example of this, really centering this around the CAR T-cell side of things, would be looking at the data that came out on the BB2121 data that came out at ASCO in June, which was showing the median progression-free survival of 11.8 months. Now, the challenge, and we'll get into some of this later on, is that some people were really pinning their hopes on a cure. And if you think cure and you get nearly a year of progression-free survival, that can be a really hard thing to take. But when you look at the type of patient population that was in these trials, the multi-relapse refractory patients, the thought would be, what other treatment out there in development is showing nearly 12 months of progression-free survival from a median standpoint? So patients that aren't necessarily jumping into the T-cells right now.
Yeah. These were patients on 10, 11, 12, 13 lines of therapy. So that's what you're saying.
I think it went upwards to like 23 prior lines of therapy, if I remember correctly. So, when you look at this, the whole thing is, part of the question is when's the right time, potentially for a clinical trial? And that's really where you need to be actively involved with your doctor and talking through this, because, if we look at this, you can sit here and watch some of the data. Most of the CAR T-cell trials are what's in phase 1 dose escalation. So there's a big logistical challenge around getting into these CAR T-cell trials, and we'll address that in the action standpoint. But they're still looking to find out what's the right dose. And again, going back to the data from BB2121, it's really interesting because if you look at the median progression-free survival at a dosage, when you're getting BB2121, the T-cell product, when you're getting that at 150 million cells, the progression-free survival was 11.8 months. For the patients who got that at an earlier dose level of 50 million cells, and I know it's a lot of numbers, but it's important, they were seeing a median progression-free survival of 2.7 months, right? So there's a lot of data that they're working through right now, both on a safety standpoint and trying to figure out, one, what's the right patient population? How much of an expression of BCMA, right, the B-cell maturation antigen, which is a target that many of the CAR T-cells are looking at, is there a certain threshold that patients need to have in order for this to be successful? Or is there a certain dosing where they start to see this? And you can see they tripled the dose and they went from 2.7 median progression-free survival up to 11.8. So it's a good idea to be aware of these so you can start looking at this to be prepared if and when that day comes when you have to make a decision.
Yeah, I want to jump in for a second. And just overall, why have I've been just so avid about why we should participate in clinical trials. And as we think about this, sometimes patients will say, especially, sometimes patients we've seen in these meetings for HealthTree across the country, they'll say, well, I'm on a certain, standard of care protocol, so why would I ever want to consider a clinical trial? And to me, the answer is because we don't have a cure yet. So if the drugs we were using in the clinic were curative, then great. I mean, let's all do that. But the clinical trial process is bringing new drugs like the CAR T or like even daratumumab or elotuzumab or some of these newer types of drugs into the clinic, and now that's the only way they're going to get there. So in looking at, like I look at relapse, would I ever consider going to do a single stem cell transplant again? Because, for example, I had a good response to mine. So why wouldn't I just go repeat that in a standard care clinic? I would never do that. I would, if I were going to do another stem cell transplant, which I hope I don't want to do, again, after doing 2 already, I would do a stem cell transplant that had that was part of a clinical trial, like with a vaccine to extend the remission, or something else that's that's going to get me further out the door. So anyway, that's just my passion is we do clinical trials, or we participate because there's no cure yet.
Yeah, well, it's well said. I mean, that's it, right? How do we? The reason that I always say my mom was given 30 days to live. And she ended up living for just under 2 years. And I always say it's not the outcome, obviously, that we wanted, but it was 2 years that we thought we never expected to have with my mom, right? And the reason for that is because of all the patients that came before her, right? My mom was diagnosed in 2005, right? A very different time frame.
Yeah.
She was sent home with a Velcade pump, right? Revlimid wasn't approved FDA until December of 2015, so she was still approximately 7 or 8 months away from even Revlimid coming out on FDA approval. So, it was a very different time frame, but the patients that came before her helped her to live longer, just like she's, her data set is part of the MyPRS genetic test, which is a really cool thing. It's helping patients live longer. So we all add up to this cumulative whole of understanding this disease better and better. And we have to keep pushing that forward. And clinical research is the only way that happens. And sort of continuing that point, from an awareness standpoint, the number one thing that we think that anybody can do on this is to, number one, make sure they're seeing a myeloma specialist, or make sure that a specialist is part of their team.
Absolutely.
That is such a huge part. And this, you guys covered the Mayo study that came out showing the overall survival benefit if you're being seen by a doctor that sees multiple patients that have multiple myeloma. It's the fact that if from the study that came out, if a doctor sees between 3 and 10 myeloma patients in a year, the overall survival showed doubling versus those that see less than that. So, you want to make sure that you're going to a doctor in a facility. And I want to be, there's a caveat here. This doesn't mean, for someone that's in a community setting or that's seeing a local hematology oncologist, a hemonc doc, it doesn't mean that they're not good at what they do, right? It doesn't mean that you can't continue to receive care there because it might be convenient. A good point, point this might be in Florida, right? There's Florida cancer specialists spread out all over the state, and then you have Moffitt, you might have Mayo Jacksonville, right? And you could go to potentially see these docs there at Shands, University of Florida, and still receive care in the community setting. But it's bringing a myeloma specialist onto your team who maybe you're connecting with them once a year. It depends on the need of your need individually as a patient. Might be every 6 months, might be a year. But that way you have someone who's staying on top of the research and the literature that can help direct and guide, the care that you're receiving.
Yeah, I agree. And a University of North Carolina study came out in the last 6 months that said if you were treated by a myeloma specialist within the first year of being diagnosed, you live 39% longer. And I think if there were a drug that were getting us 39% more life, we would all be taking it, and it would be this mega blockbuster drug.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think Dr. Voorhees, someone had shared that information at one of our last events. That's a great point to bring up. And the other thing too, when we look at this outside of the myeloma specialist, I know we talked about how the changing landscape, but kind of going back as we get to the understanding barrier, we had a patient who gave us the analogy once, and I really loved it. I think it hit really close to home. He said, I feel like I'm a frog sitting on a lily pad. And he said, by working with you, I'm making sure there's always another lily pad that I can jump to. And he's like, my job is to not run out of lily pads, right? And I love it for the simplicity of it, but it's right there, we can't run out of options, right? There's only so many FDA-approved options, and clinical trials can and will represent, a number of potential lily pads that patients can jump to. So the idea is, how do you constantly stay on top of that so you always have plan A, plan B, plan C as you progress through from MGUS to smoldering to myeloma, into relapse refractory myeloma. We think that's a really, really, important part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And, if we jump there from the awareness, right, once you're aware, and it's worth making the point if we didn't make that already, there are trials available. I think it's probably one of the most, when we do any of our roundtable events, Jenny, we always have a slide in our section that shows the number of active trials for every status and diagnosis, right? So there's trials at newly diagnosed myeloma, first-line relapse, second-line, third-line plus relapse. But there's also trials getting into the smoldering setting, as we're all very well aware. But, there's even a DARA study for high-risk MGUS. So when we look at that spectrum, wow. There are clinical trials. So to be aware, right, that there are trials at every one of these phases. And, we're big proponents of clinical trials. We're big believers in the research and advancing the science. But we also realize that a clinical trial isn't going to be right for every single patient, every single point in time, right? So, and that's where we kind of circle back into the specialist, but it's really being aware. Once we, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think the point you made earlier in the show needs to be stressed just a little bit. When you think about joining a clinical trial, because you're thinking about every stage, it's better than saying, well, I ran out of all my options and now I'm going to go join a clinical trial. Because at that point, you may not be fit enough to join the trial, or you may have kidney damage or whatever. You may have things you can't control, and it's just not a wise time to start thinking about a clinical trial. Yeah. So if you do your homework ahead of time and you're prepared, you kind of can also understand the landscape and kind of start assessing what looks more promising and what may be better for you personally as well.
100%. And, it's an interesting point to bring up, because if we look at this, sometimes, there's a thought that, well, maybe a CAR T-cell trial, isn't right yet for me. Maybe I want to wait until it's in phase 2 or phase 3 when they know a little bit more about it. Okay, I can appreciate that viewpoint, right? There's always a double-edged sword around this, right? Maybe as it moves along in the clinical trial phases, right, from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and into FDA, potential approval, it'll be more accessible. There'll be more opportunities to participate. We'll know more, and that's a good thing. But you run the flip side of, we don't know what happens, as you said there. What happens 6 months from now or a year from now, right? Or your blood counts, can they hold up to get into a trial? What about your creatinine? Any of these things. Would you be eligible and would you be a good candidate for some of these experimental treatments if you wait, right? So there's never a definitive answer, right? We're always working, essentially from an area of not total information, right? It's only in retrospect when we look back and we say, oh, that was a good decision, or maybe that wasn't the best decision based on what happens. But we don't often have the benefit of foresight, when we're making some of these decisions. And, it kind of goes hand in hand with the clinical research side of things. So, it definitely is some muddied water on that side, which is challenging, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when we look at this, when we look at it from an understanding standpoint, right, if we move into sort of that next barrier, for us, it really comes down to, how do we set expectations for the trial, right? So what do you, as a patient, what can you expect from the trial? Why is this research going on? Why do these people believe in it? Why are they pushing this forward? If it's a later stage trial, if it's in a phase 2 or phase 3, what's some of the results that you've seen that show that this could potentially make sense? But also, is the patient, what is the trial going to expect of you, right? Because there's going to be travel commitments. There's going to be blood draws. There's going to be site visits. Financially, what does that impact look like? Now, from a high level, we can say, the trials are going to cover, the treatment, or maybe some of the things that are going into that trial that are experimental. And the other things are going to be billed into insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, different things. But what are the financial considerations? If you have to travel for a CAR T-cell trial, where are you going to stay? If you have to stay for 30 or 60 days, is it on you? There are some nonprofits that actually do have funding available for patients in clinical trials. Some of the centers may have a Hope Lodge equivalent, right, like outside of Dana-Farber, and I think there's I think it's like 30 some of the Hope Lodges around there. What are the ways that you can go about this to actually participate, and how can you understand it in a way that actually makes sense to you, so you can have a viable conversation with your doctor to say, does this make sense, and really understand it. That's a big factor in this. And we actually work really closely with pharmaceutical companies to actually gain access to their protocols, to what's called the informed consent. So anyone that's not familiar on the research side, there are documents. The protocol document is sort of the master document. It's the instructions of how this trial is going to be run, and it gives you insights into what's the rationale for the study and what things are going to be excluded, what things are going to be included, what's all the research. So that's what's presented to the FDA to get approval to move into this, or part of that FDA approval process. There's a secondary document called the informed consent, and it's sort of like the clinical trials 101 document for that, right? They really break it down into more accessible language about what the expectations are throughout this trial. So we're working closely with a number of pharmaceutical companies and sponsors and hospitals to gain access to these documents so we can present them back on the SparkCures website, because what's currently out there and publicly available isn't really helpful. There's a lot of data and information missing, and we're trying to improve that access so that, people can go out there and learn about these trials and understand them in a way that up to this point, has been very difficult, because you'd have to actually be in the pre-screening visit to get access to some of this information, which, is a really difficult process.
Right, and you're traveling everywhere. That's been some of the what's driven really the Myeloma Crowd Radio program too. Let's hear from the investigators themselves why they're running this and what the study's all about and who can join.
Yeah, the fact that you can sort of take that and bottle it up and get that out to all these patients at once, right? Because these doctors don't have, no one has that time, right? We all have 24 hours in a day, So to take that time to speak individually is very difficult. So if we can disseminate that information more efficiently and effectively, it's a win for everybody. The other thing too on the understanding side, and this kind of bridges everything, but we'll get calls where, maybe platelets are down, right? And sort of the threshold for some of the blood work, if you look at platelets, it's going to be 50, 75, or 100, or some of the cutoffs. And patients say, well, my platelets are too low. I can't participate in a clinical trial, so I don't know what I'm going to do next. And, it's not just clinical trials. There's off-label use, right? So we can look at venetoclax, right? It's approved. It has FDA approval, not in myeloma. And at one point, you were able to get it through expanded access before it came out and received that. But you can look at receiving that as an off-label use at this point. Or selinexor, which is Karyopharm, you can look at compassionate use. So if you're not eligible for some reason for the trial, you may be able to gain access to that through the compassionate use mechanism. And one other one that may be worth discussing is the idasanetlin, which is Genentech, and that's being geared towards the 17p deletion population, is also potentially available through compassionate use. So even if, there's a patient who maybe on paper isn't eligible or doesn't seem to be eligible for a trial, it doesn't mean that there still aren't options once you've exhausted, prior FDA-approved treatments on that side, which I think is a really important point to make, because doctors don't always, bring that up, or they'll say, well, we're going to go on a bendamustine regimen and we're just going to go on this. And that could be fine. There could be reasons to do that. We're not advocating for or against that. What we're advocating for is options, right? Let's put the venetoclax or the selinexor or the idasanetlin, let's get this on the table and help your doctor and you have this conversation to decide, oh, maybe it does make sense to pursue a compassionate use regimen, and what would that look like? Are all really important considerations.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about when you're planning your care, and you really have to, it's not fair that we have to self-advocate, but you do. Just because of the complexity of the disease, and Pat Killingsworth would say that all the time. It's not fair, but we still have to do it if we want good outcomes. So it's really a necessity.
It really is. And going into that sort of self-advocating, you're absolutely right. I mean, at the end of the day, we had a call just earlier today with this lovely woman, and she was running into some static at her doctor's, and it's, unfortunately, you're going to have to advocate for yourself. You're running into some roadblocks here, and we can kind of help talk through this, but you're going to need to advocate if your doctor isn't maybe open or isn't able to provide the support that you're looking for. if we look at the action component of this, right, that action barrier, right, it's no better illustrated than you tried calling to stay ahead of the game, and 2 of the 8 called you back, right? 2 of the 8.
Mm-hmm.
That's it's unbelievable how difficult this is, And look, there's turnover. There's people that no longer, maybe they get moved to a different department. All that's understandable, right? But the challenge is when people are in a very acute situation or when they're looking to get this information, how do we do this as quickly and as, effectively as possible? And, sort of the first aspect of this is really to talk to your doctor, right? I mean, again, make sure there's a myeloma specialist on the team, but self-advocate. If your doctor isn't telling you about clinical trials, ask at your next appointment, right? And it could just be, look, are there any trials here, right, that maybe make sense now or at a future relapse that we should be keeping an eye on, right? And you can always extend that to say, if it's not here, are there other areas, right? Are there other trials maybe around the country that you're keeping an eye on that seem to be really interesting or that are showing some nice results or you're most interested in? That's a good way to sort of start that conversation with your doctor.
And depending on the doctor, they may or may not share clinical trials that are open at other facilities. And I think patients do need to be aware of that sometimes they may not share a clinical trial just because it's not at their facility. So they may want to focus just on the trials that they're running for their patients. So as a patient, that's why the SparkCures tool is so good, because you're able to see everything, and geographically and in other ways.
That's right. And look, for us, it doesn't matter to us. What we care about is helping the patient, right? And that doesn't mean there's not a specific trial. The agenda is not this trial over that trial. That's a conversation for you to have with your doctor, right? It's not, our agenda isn't this treatment center over that treatment center. What's more convenient for you? Are you getting along with your doctor, right? Your doctor may be brilliant. He might be great, or she might be great, but is it part of the care team that you want? Are they interacting with you? Are you getting the supportive care that you need, from your care team? If not, maybe it's time for a change, or maybe, are there different ways that you can approach it, right? All those things come into play when we look at this. And I think that, when we look overall, right, so it's talking to your doctor, absolutely, but it's also, make sure that you're prepared, self-advocating, have your records ready, know what your latest lab results are. I know that Dr. Hoffmeister is now down at Emory, a great myeloma doctor. He's one of our medical advisors, and he gets so excited when patients show up and they have their M-spike or their free light chains mapped out, and with either Microsoft Excel, or if you're a Mac person, Numbers, or Google, spreadsheets, it's pretty easy to map those things out, and it really helps to keep a handle on that. So, as much as people are comfortable, be as actively involved with those things, at least so if you're looking at a trial and it's at another facility, you have access to this information and can get that over pretty quickly, to see if something might make sense, one of these trials.
And this is really where HealthTree helps out as well, because that's what a lot of patients have said to us as we've traveled around the country. This is finally, I have one place to put all my information. Mm-hmm. And we have the ability for you to enter labs manually if you only have a printout, or we will be working on electronic pulls from your patient portal, let's say, or your electronic medical record. And that just makes things so much easier. And the doctors, we showed HealthTree to Dr. Hoffmeister, and he just said, oh, this is amazing that you could have everything on a summary page. And so, for clinical trials and normal treatment options. So it's a really important thing to have everything together. You're right.
100%. Well, and most patients that are multi-relapse refractory, you might be, Jenny, how many centers of care, how many centers have you been at? Huntsman,
3.
MD Anderson, 3,
yep.
right? So now all of a sudden you're interested in getting in a trial. Well, guess what? You got to go through all 3 of those for data release, right, to get all that information over, because they're going to have to do their due diligence, make sure that they can follow that and prove that you're a progressive disease and that, what prior treatments you say you've had that you've actually had. So, it gets really complicated, right? Especially as it doesn't get easier as the disease progresses, right? So when you're at a point where you have more energy, chemo brain isn't kicking in or, any of that, it's best to stay on top of this to the best of your ability. If we keep rolling down that line of sort of action barriers, another thing is don't rule yourself out of a clinical trial as a patient, right? And I say this with caveats. What I mean by that is we were just on, there was a Facebook question that popped up, I think it was a week or so ago, and there was a patient who said, well, non-secretory, I'm oligosecretory, I can't remember which one it was, but so I'm not eligible for any clinical trials. And it's like, well, that it may be true that you may not be eligible, right, but not necessarily for that reason, right? And for anyone who's looking at this, like oligosecretory would be, where your serum, where your blood or urine M protein levels are below the threshold. So clinical trials will have measurable disease thresholds where if you track your M spike through serum, it might be 0.5 grams per deciliter or 1, or there'll be certain thresholds on your free light chains. But for patients that maybe are oligosecretory or non-secretory, you can also look at bone marrow plasma cell percentages or a measurable plasmacytoma. Now, unfortunately, not all trials will allow for that, but there are some that do. So what I would advise is don't rule yourself out, until we can actually know for certain when we go through it, because there's an awful lot of trials. And in that same token, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, one other comment is you need to know the criteria once you join the study, because my dear friend Liz joined a study and she didn't know that her iron level had to be a certain level, so she was eating vegetarian and then her iron level dropped and she had to leave the study. So once you're in a study, you need to understand what those criteria are so you can kind of watch them and do whatever adjusting that you can do personally.
That's a great point, and it kind of lends into the next part of this, which, not ruling yourself out would be there's a big difference between not eligible and not yet eligible. And we've actually rewrote our entire software at the beginning of this year to allow for this new consideration of not yet eligible. And what we mean by that is if we look at an inclusion-exclusion criteria, many trials will say if you've had a prior allogeneic stem cell transplant, which is a donor transplant, that you're not eligible for the trial. Well, that's a not eligible, right? Unless the protocol is amended, unless there's a change, you're not going to be eligible for this trial at all because you've had a prior allo. But there are things like your lab values, like your creatinine or your GFR or your ANC or platelets that if you're below a certain threshold, right, if your GFR is, say, below 45 or below 40, maybe you're not eligible, right, which is a measure of how well the kidneys are working. But then we know what to look for, right? If you're really interested in that trial, then we know if your creatinine comes down, the GFR should be calculated a little bit higher, and we have the numbers that we can look at to say, oh, okay, now maybe it does make sense, right? Now we're aware of what things we have to keep tabs of. Same thing on the CAR T cell side. Most of them will say you have to have at least 3 prior lines of therapy or be double refractory. So you're going to need at least 2, but most likely 3 lines of therapy in order to participate. Now that's changing. We're starting to see some of them coming up into the first-line relapse territory. But it doesn't mean that you're not eligible. It just means that you haven't gone through enough prior lines of therapy in order to be accepted into the study. So by understanding those things, we know what to keep our eyes on if and when that time comes to help make that connection.
Yeah, that's great.
And, and a lot of this comes down to asking a lot of questions, right? One of the big things is if you go in for a trial and you're told you're not eligible, ask why, right? And keep asking until you understand that. We had a patient that was told they weren't eligible due to their creatinine levels. So they came back, they reported it back to us. We looked at the protocol, and their creatinine levels were within bounds, within limits for the trial. So they went back the next doctor appointment. They said, well, actually, I think I am eligible. And, it ended up the doctor, the nurse coordinator, the trial coordinator misspoke, and it was the GFR that allowed for that. But, again, we're not going to know unless we're asking these questions. Why am I ineligible? But it gets even, more important. We had a patient who was told they weren't eligible because they had plasma cell leukemia, PCL. And we looked at the labs, and there was a very low percent of circulating cells. Well, plasma cell leukemia is defined at the 20% circulating plasma cell limit. They were drastically underneath that. And we ended up going back and advocating through both the site and the sponsor of the study to say, if they're not eligible, that's okay. But help us understand this, because as it stands, they're being excluded for a reason that we think doesn't match up with their labs. And ended up, there was some confusion and things, so they ended up being allowed to present for pre-screening on the study. So we really have to ask a lot of questions. We're all human, right? Mistakes can and do happen. And again, it's probably another good point of self-advocating, right? Even if they say you're not eligible, don't just take that and walk on, right? Say, well, can you help me understand why, right? Am I not eligible or am I not yet eligible, and what does that mean? But the other things too around taking or asking questions really revolve around when you're considering a trial. One of the big things will be, we talked about this before, it's the trial landscape is constantly shifting and changing. Patients with a prior allo 5 years ago didn't know that having an allogeneic stem cell transplant would make them ineligible for basically all the CAR T-cell trials. Not all of them, but most of them right now. Well, that's a hard thing to know 5 years out. So one of the questions, if you're considering a trial, is, will this trial make me ineligible for future trials? And here's where I don't want to turn into alphabet soup, but if we look again at the BCMA protein, right, there's a lot of immunotherapy that's beginning to target BCMA, right, the CAR T cells, as well as the antibody drug conjugates and the bispecific antibodies. They have targets that are looking at BCMA on the myeloma cells. Well, as it stands, if you go on to one of these bispecific or antibody drug conjugate trials targeting BCMA, you might be ruling yourself out for the CAR T BCMA trials, at least as it's written right now. And maybe that will change 6 months or a year or 2 years from now, or when one of them receives potential FDA approval. But as it stands, you might be ruling yourself out. So you kind of go back to that double-edged sword again that we talked about, Jenny, with, maybe you want to wait for the CAR T, but if you wait and don't do one of these trials, what if you're, so sick or your disease has progressed that you can't actually get access to it, right? So you are waiting for something specifically, and then you kind of rule yourself out just because your disease has progressed. So, these are challenges that there's not really a very good answer to. It really comes down to an individual, making that decision with their doctor and at least understanding, right? Knowing if they hold off, here's what could happen, or knowing if they go on, it could be removing some of these trials potentially forever. Even when it's FDA approved, we don't know what that's ultimately going to look like. So there's a lot of challenges around that.
Yeah, and it looks like things are shifting in the CAR T environment also, because will there be trials that test two CAR Ts at the same time, not just a BCMA target, but BCMA plus something else? So it's this, it's this game of strategy, I think, for myeloma patients to better understand their disease, and then what's available and what's optimal for them at one time. And they, that's why we've built these tools to help. And SparkCures is a terrific tool to help with this.
Well, I appreciate that. And if we look at that, if we jump into a little bit on the CAR T cell side, because I know part of the conversation was around getting into these, when we look at this, I think it's clear, I want to make clear that I don't think there's ever been clinical trials that are like these CAR T cells. And what I mean by that is they're so heavily publicized and so many people know about them, and everybody is saying, what about CAR T? What about, it ends up being seemingly a lot of times that BB2121 and CAR T are so synonymous because it was kind of the first out the gate and the first to come out with their numbers. We've had patients who are frontline, newly diagnosed, untreated, calling up and saying, I want to get into this CAR T cell trial. And what I would say is, if I would empathize and say, if I were in your shoes, I'd be looking at the same thing. It's just not yet available in that setting, right? It's going to take some time to get there. So not only is it heavily publicized, it's supply and demand. There are a lot of patients that want to get into these studies, but, there's very few spots available, right? So there's a lot of interest without a lot of ability to get these patients in, which makes it challenging in and of itself. But then if we compound it with the fact that these CAR T cells, it really is a personalized medicine. They're taking out your T cells from each individual person. In the case of a CAR T cell trial, they're re-engineering it to target that BCMA protein, or in the case of one, there is one CD38 CAR T cell trial. So they're re-engineering it, and then they have to grow it, or what they call expand, right, these high-quality T cells to infuse back in. Well, that could take upwards of a month, right? So when we look at this, very few spots are available, And if we look at their dose escalating, putting this through, so a patient has to go on, they have to be eligible right at that moment, which is oftentimes very tricky to find. They're going to go through maybe there's a conditioning regimen, a lymphodepleting regimen. They're going to go through, it's a month of waiting for those cells to grow. Then it's reinfused back, and then it could be upwards of another month that they're waiting to see how the patient responds before that next patient goes in, right? So there's a lengthy time process with very few eligible slots on the CAR T side. So it's very tricky. And if we look at what can you do as a patient or a caregiver to help maximize that, there are some thoughts to this. And, the first, and I say all of these, Jenny, with the caveat of not everyone has the same resources, right? Not everyone is able to pick up at the drop of a hat and fly across the country if a spot were to open up, right? Not everybody has the luxury of time off from work or can leave, at the drop of a dime without other considerations, right? So, all those things being pushed aside for a second, not that they're not important, but just sort of talking through some high-level things, you want to spread the net as far and wide as you possibly can. There's a number of centers that are running CAR T cells. When we're looking at this with patients, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll say, well, what's the way that we can sort of maximize the exposure to CAR T cell trials? What I mean by that is, let's say there's 2 or 3 CAR T cell trials at one location. Sarah Cannon has, I think, 4 at this point, right? So we say, well, if we look to get you over to Sarah Cannon, and then if we look at maybe, Moffitt or University of Chicago or Emory, well, there's a little bit of overlap. They each have one of the same, but instead of, if you go to 2 places, maybe we can get you considered for 5 or 6 of the CAR T cell trials or 4 or 5 of the CAR T cell trials, right? So how can we sort of maximize that and get that in there? Some of these places will actually allow you to call and be placed on the list without actually traveling up and getting a consult at that center. Fred Hutch is one of them. You can call the immunotherapy line there, and you can actually get placed on that wait list. They have 2 CAR T cell trials running right now that are investigator-initiated. And so you can go through that route. You could call the NIH and be evaluated. There's a hospital up in Rhode Island, Roger Williams, that you can call to be considered for the CD38, and they'll at least look at it remotely. So for patients that maybe don't have the wherewithal to get up and travel to all these centers, there are places that they can call, send their files up, send their records up, and at least have some sense of, yes, they may be a potential candidate, or no, for these specific reasons, right? And once you go through that, once you either call or you're there in person, what we like to say is, you got to be persistent, again, self-advocating. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Follow up every month. Send them your latest lab values. Let them know you're still interested. Maybe you're stable disease, or maybe your M spike is going up if you track it through that, but it hasn't gone enough to be considered progressive disease yet. That's okay, right? The timing of this is, we would say, get out there and make as much noise. Make sure that these coordinators aren't going to forget your name, your email, your voice if you're calling. It's one of the big ways to go through.
Okay, let me ask you a question, Brian, because when I was talking to Dr. Raje about the CAR T trials, and this was probably 6 months ago, she said if you're applying to get into a specific CAR T trial and it's being run at multiple centers, please don't call each center for the same trial, because then that kind of messes with our waiting list, and we don't, somebody might be on 5 lists for the same study, but what you're saying is you could you could put your name on 5 different trials. So I want to make that clarification, because she just said it's just a challenge for them to pick who is going to be, taken care of next. And these are patients who are, really in need. So
it does, and you're right. I don't think this is easy on anybody, right? The centers are struggling with sometimes how to fill this as well, because they're getting so many requests to go in there. But I can point to a number of examples where patients that we've been working with or in contact with have been on the wait list at both their home center and at a remote location, and they've gotten onto the trial at a remote location instead of at their home center. Right. So, my take on that is, unfortunately, we don't want to create more complexity and more issues for the centers. But, we're big proponents here of what we call patients first. It's the first thing you see when you walk in the door. And, for us, that means we do what's right by patients, right? And if spreading the net maybe makes it a little bit more cumbersome, we're sorry for that. But we are seeing patients who are getting in at the same trial when they couldn't even get at their own center. So it's hard to say just sort of sit back and wait, right? Wait and see what happens. And I think that this will change as time goes on, as more trials are opening up. We're seeing more and more CAR T-cell trials, opening up later in Q3 and Q4 of this year as well as 2019. So as these centers get trialed and get availability and get slots for the CAR T, we're going to start to see this even out a little bit. It's still kind of the Wild West, right? I mean, we're in phase 1 with an awful lot of patients looking to get in. I mean, if patients are looking at other trials outside of CAR Ts, they're not going to see the same logistical issues that exist, right? So this is not in any way sort of a tell-all of how getting into a clinical trial looks, right? This is not representative of the typical process. This is really an outlier in a lot of that. So we look at it that way, and making sure, again, one of those action components on the CAR T cell side, taking action, is to get out there, join support groups, whether that's in person, whether that's the Myeloma Crowd mentors. And, I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit, Jenny, but, there's the Facebook groups. And I know, Jenny, you're actively involved in that. Dana Holmes, Bonnie Falbo, there are great groups out there that patients can go and connect and learn and connect with people who are going through this process, people who are trying and unfortunately failing to get into CAR T cells, people who are trying and getting into them and then sharing their experiences. And it's a really incredible thing. I mean, Cherie Reinecker, is out there and sharing her story and really open to telling what that was like on the BB2121 study that she was on. Is there a lot of patients, too many to name? But there's a caveat I would put on that, Jenny, and that's that as great as these community connectors are, there's always a little bit of a, there's a caveat of it's great to hear someone's experience, but you can't put that onto your own, right? We'll have patients who will call in about a trial and say, well, I talked to someone on Facebook and they were on it and they didn't do well, so I don't want to go on that one. And we'll go, and that's everyone's right to say that, right? But let's make sure we're working backwards from really good information, because what if it was a dose escalation study that the patient you're talking to was one of the first patients to go on, and they didn't see a response because of the low dose, but now they're at dose expansion, meaning they've gotten to the dose that they think they're going to take into a phase 2, and they're looking for more patients. That can be a very different conversation. I mean, if you look back at the BB2121, right, the dose of 50 million cells was very different in outcome of the dose of 150 million cells, right? So make sure you have the whole picture around this, and then talk to your doctor, right? Don't dismiss this out of hand, right? We can take all this anecdotal information, but at the end of the day, Jenny, you're a sample of one. There's one Jenny Ahlstrom, right? And it's unfortunate. I wish we could clone you and do this for more patients. But, everyone is a sample of one. I remember when my mom was sort of at the end stages there, and they told us, they said there's less than a 5% chance that she'll pull out of this. And on one hand, I can appreciate setting expectations, right, for us as a family. On the other, I remember being so angry, and probably angry at the situation, right, of losing my mom, but angry in that, don't take away hope, right? There's still maybe only 5% of people do, right? But that means there's 5 people out of 100 that can pull out of this, right? And I know that's kind of difficult, but I remember thinking, like, my mom isn't one of those 100 people, right? My mom is my mom, and we'll see if she's going to pull out or not. Unfortunately, she didn't. And again, so I can appreciate the setting expectations and having those difficult conversations. But, that's a big part of it when we look at getting out there and sharing these experiences. And, I think one of the cool things about these groups, Jenny, and we're from Pittsburgh. We're based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And for anyone that knows Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, he had this great quote, and he said, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You'll always find people who are helping. And I think it hits so close home, because the myeloma community is so open and welcoming and so great to share information and news. And in the midst of an incurable cancer as it stands today, we don't want to look at that. We want to look at there's all this hope, and there are these people who are putting up time and energy, and the myeloma docs and the researchers and the patients and the caregivers and, the husbands and the brothers and the kids. I think it's such an amazing thing to be a part of. So, joining those groups and being part of that and having access to these helpers is so critical for everybody.
Yeah, I completely agree. It really speaks to the power of the individual patient. I mean, we're powerful as an individual when we self-advocate, but we're also powerful when we get together and are collective about moving things forward. That applies for the clinical trials and the participation that we have in terms of joining the trials. But when we use tools like these, like SparkCures and like the HealthTree tool, we are helping each other. And we're going to be developing a program called Myeloma Coach, which will be kind of a mentoring program to help patients with the clinical trials also, and with HealthTree and with other aspects of having myeloma, because there are many, many people that we've run across who say, I want to help and I want to raise my hand and I want to help other people. I've been given lots of blessings and I want to give back. So you see people like that in the Facebook groups, and they're terrific and wonderful, and they want to help other people. And we all, I think, just want to cure for myeloma.
Yeah, I love it. And I didn't realize it was Myeloma Coach now. I misspoke earlier, but it's such a powerful way for patients to give back. And a lot of the ones that we talk through do want to give back. And you hit a great point in that, when patients are calling us and we're talking to people, the nice thing about this too is SparkCures is spreading our net far and wide too. We have almost like all these individual people around the country reporting back and saying, hey, listen, here's what just happened on this CAR T cell, or here's how I got in, which can help us to then, send that signal out to a lot of other people who are going through this process and letting them know. Or I just came from my doctor's and the trial is open. It's not listed publicly yet. Let's make sure we let people know. We got one of those calls today, and so that we were able to update the database, get that set up there, and, alert patients that may be eligible that something has changed on one of these trials so that they're always kept up to speed and up to date on it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to leave some time for questions. We don't have a lot of time left, but we have a little bit. So if you have a question for Brian about joining clinical trials and maybe navigating those steps, you can call 347-637-2631 and press 1 on your keypad. And if you have any specific questions about the CAR T trials also, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we have a caller at 949. Let's see. We have a caller at 264-7609 first. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, Jenny and Brian. It's Jack Aiello.
Hey, Jack.
I've enjoyed your interview. You do great things helping patients get into clinical trials. Brian, I'm wondering, do folks ever ask you about their financial responsibilities in trials? That's usually not laid out until they see an informed consent, but I'm always concerned that they kind of skip that part of it in case there are any kind of financial responsibilities.
Yeah. So one, Jack, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And, the financial considerations are so imperative. And when it comes up, we always say, part of the challenge, Jack, and this is that, there's as many answers to that question as there are patients and there are insurance plans in terms of how they're going to go about covering and what that looks like. What we typically advocate for, what we typically talk through in terms of our process is, let's start backwards and see if there's a trial that even makes sense first. Let's see if there's one that you may be eligible for. Let's talk through this with your doctor, see what they think. And then let's get over there and talk to the center itself. Let's get in touch with the social worker. What sort of resources do they provide there? Housing, financial support, anything of that nature? Are there some nonprofits that we can maybe connect them with? And we can sort of walk through that step. But we like to at least have something definitively that we can point towards, because that really helps to have that conversation. Because I would say it's one of the most critical questions that's going to come up. But we have to work backwards from the trial in mind to see how that's going to work.
Sure, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Another caller, 949-5572. Go ahead and do your question.
Oh, hey, Brian. It's Paul Walsh.
Go ahead.
How are you?
Hey, Paul. Good to hear
Brian.
from you.
Hi. Hey, good to hear from you, too. Great show. Thank you for taking the time. It's just, first of all, it's just amazing. It's an amazing job you've done at demystifying the clinical trial process and providing real access to patients. This is like a dream. And I can't think of another example of any other cancer having this level of access. So thank you for your time and your commitment to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And also, I just want to highlight this collaboration between SparkCures and HealthTree and Myeloma Crowd is also kind of one of these other unprecedented areas where both of you have just taken this really abundant approach of taking a patient-centric approach and saying we're just kind of focused on the outcomes. Question for you is, how did you? I mean, you have lots of other things you could be doing with your time and your energy, and you have gone so deep in this space. How do you justify just keeping it in myeloma? And I mean, it's an amazing resource for the community, but is this sustainable? And will this be a resource that's going to be available to patients for years to come?
Yeah.
I know you've. Anyways, it's just kind of because as patients are committing to this is an amazing resource. It's really unheard of.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I think it's a really great question. And we've batted this around too at different events that we've been at, and I think for us, what we have to remember is that there's a lot of places that patients can go to get information. Right? They could say, well, I'm happy to talk to my doctor, and that's okay, right? Or I'll use clinicaltrials.gov and I'll go through that, and we have no problem with that. I think if there's a setting that patients are comfortable with, they should continue to use that. But when we look at it, like Jenny said, there's not a cure, right? And there's a lot of roadblocks and barriers to patients getting access to this. And I think that we're taking a very centric approach on this side to really solve this problem. I think we've done a really nice job in a lot of ways, but there's still a lot of work left to be done. And when we look at this, part of this is how do we create a model that can be replicated, that we can pick up and we can take into, even in the blood cancer side, leukemia, lymphoma, MDS, and we'll get there. And that's part of the plan. But for us right now, we're looking at how do we really work directly with patients? How do we do this? We've seen a number of competitors, one in particular who I don't want to throw them under the bus or anything. They raised close to $20 million and went out of business a year and a half later, almost 2 years later, trying to do this because they were doing it for every indication. And the reason we can speak so definitively and we can really help through this process is because we understand myeloma, right? So there's a deep understanding, but more importantly than that, I think at the end of the day, we build trusted relationships. We want to be connected with people, on a deeper level than that. We have patients that will call us and say, I just was offered this trial by my doctor, but I didn't want to do anything until we spoke with you and your team first, right? Which is
I think
really
it's
high
the
praise.
fact that you have. Yeah, I think it's the fact that you have gone deep, and you've gone so deep that you have built this, trust at every layer of the network, and so it's just astonishing.
Yeah, well, thank you, and for us, we're sustainable, and we haven't taken money. This is all I self-funded everything myself for the first nearly 2 years of the company, and the nice thing about this is there's no shot clock on us, as it were. There's nothing that we have to do. We're going to grow when we're ready to grow. We're going to jump into other indications when we're ready and when we think it makes sense for patients and what makes sense for us, which really is a nice thing because it keeps us really in control of, our destiny. And we don't have to do things that maybe don't make sense if we can't deliver the high quality, service and matching and everything else that we've been doing and we've been building up to. So in that sense, it puts the future in our hands as to how and when we're going to do that.
Yeah, well, the commitment and the quality really shows. Jenny, I had a quick question for you. How do patients and caregivers become myeloma coaches? How can they get involved and help facilitate it? Because to really make this work, there needs to be a broader community of people that are going to be providing that coaching and guidance that you guys are providing through digital means, but sometimes they just need people that may not have access to the technology sitting next to them, helping them out.
Right. So we are working on building that program right now. And right now, if you want to become a myeloma coach and you have some hours to volunteer every month and you're willing to help others, you can email us at info@crowdcare.org and we'll start that conversation with you. We have a small set of people who are working with us right now on that to help us expand this program. And that's really the first way to start. You'll be seeing some information shortly on the Myeloma Crowd site, more about this program, how to sign up, how to set your hours, things like that, all the details behind it. But before we end, I just want to explain also how we've integrated with SparkCures, because some people might say, well, if I already have a SparkCures account, then do I really need to log into HealthTree? Or if I have a HealthTree account, what's the integration there? So SparkCures is focused on the clinical trials and finding those clinical trials. And as you can hear from what we've talked about already, it's a really incredibly valuable tool and goes amazingly deep on that. Some people want to understand their in the clinic treatment options as well, like what's currently available. So now inside of HealthTree, you're basically creating a SparkCures account at the same time. So if you don't have one already, you don't have to go to SparkCures and create an account. You can create it from within HealthTree. But if you already have a SparkCures account, you could also log into SparkCures and just go look at clinical trials separately. We have one more
Jenny,
question. No, go ahead.
If I could just throw one thing on real quick, I'm sorry. If you do have a SparkCures account and you sign up for HealthTree under the same email, our system acknowledges that, and you can we don't worry about creating another account or duplicate entries or anything. We'll link those two together and show you. So if you're in HealthTree, you'll see everything. If you're in SparkCures, you're going to see everything. So we've made that really easy on the back end side of things to connect accounts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have two more caller questions. So let me 987-0622. Go ahead with your question. Hello? Hello? This is 987-0622. Do you have a question?
Oh.
Yep, you're live.
Hi.
Hi there. Go ahead with your question. Okay, we'll go to caller 415-8677. Go ahead with your question. Are you there? Okay, well,
hello, hey Jenny.
I'm not sure.
Am I still on?
Yeah. You are.
Am I still on the call? I don't
think
you dropped me, I think, is the problem. So
you
need
okay.
to drop.
All right. No, I don't think so, because I could hear people in the background. Okay. Well, Brian, I just want to thank you for participating. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate what you've dedicated your life to doing this. It's truly amazing. And we just are so grateful.
Yeah, and Jenny, just as a quick recap, that goes both ways. I mean, the things that you were doing specifically in the team at Myeloma Crowd and Crowd Care, we've been big fans for a long time, and we're really excited to continue this relationship. And at the end of the day, the only way we're going to make inroads is by everybody working together, right? We all have to partner together in the best ways that we can and share information and help make these connections and help raise awareness and understanding around all of these. So, thank you for everything that you're doing. There is one, we did get some Facebook questions. Do I have like 2 more minutes? Is that okay to talk through on the smoldering side of things?
Mm-hmm.
We did get some questions on the smoldering side of things, and it's a really interesting and perplexing dilemma that a lot of smoldering patients who end up going into clinical trials are facing at this moment in time. And what I mean by that is, if a patient goes on to a smoldering clinical trial and they're high risk and they, tip over into symptomatic myeloma, what does that mean for their clinical trials at that initial myeloma diagnosis? Are they now, considered untreated, newly diagnosed? Will that smoldering clinical trial count against them? And even also, there's another way to look at it. If you're in a smoldering clinical trial and maybe it ends or you drop out of that, is there another smoldering trial that you could get into? And I just want to address the fact that these are all really great questions. We're not going to have definitive answers on every one of them because they're going to be a little bit different. We've seen, there are some trials that are newly diagnosed that'll say no myeloma treatment, no prior myeloma treatment, and they'll consider smoldering treatment as part of that. So even if you're newly diagnosed myeloma, some of those things would happen. So it's a very complex situation. And what I would say is if there's any smoldering patients listening, because there are trials in the smoldering setting that you can go from one to another, we're happy to talk through that and kind of address those questions one by one. We know there's less of a population out there of high-risk smoldering that are on trials, but it's getting larger and larger. And it's important if you're going to start treatment in this early phase, in this precursor stage, to understand what does that mean down the road. For instance, we had a patient who was in a smoldering trial, progressed to active myeloma, had been on 2 additional therapies as a myeloma patient when we first connected with them. The way we would interpret that, it's 3 lines of therapy, right? The smoldering clinical trial and then the 2 lines that they had as a myeloma patient. We could not get them into this clinical trial that required 3 or more prior lines of therapy. The medical monitor on the study would not accept a smoldering trial or smoldering treatment. It very specifically had to be quote unquote active myeloma treatment. And some of those things were left going, we can't do anything. If they decide to change that, that's okay. But there's not a clear-cut answer to what happened yet. So I think if anyone is smoldering or MGUS and they're considering going into these, we really need to ask some questions with these docs. What does this mean? Would I be able to go into another clinical trial? What would happen if I'm newly diagnosed and I didn't want to do the RVD plus transplant? Would I be eligible for another clinical trial, or what would that look like? So really great questions, and I want to make sure that if anyone has those, let's talk. Let's figure out what the interest lies, and we can kind of help map some of these things out on a more individualized basis. But to kind of recap all that together, I think the biggest thing, Jenny, is be aware of your options, see a myeloma specialist, make sure you're bringing a myeloma specialist on your team, number one, most important. And if we can help anyone, sign up through HealthTree. You'll also create through us as well. You can call us at any point. Our direct number is 888-828-2206. And I'm sure all this will be in the show notes. So please don't hesitate to call, email. Any question, big or small, is welcome, and we'll do what we can to help out. But, thank you for the time here, Jenny, and thanks for everything you're doing to help spread this information out there.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Brian, for participating. We're glad that you helped people understand kind of some tips and tricks, and especially for some of these really popular clinical trials. So thank you so
Absolutely.
much. And, thank you for listening to Myeloma Crowd Radio. And we hope you listen in actually on Friday with Dr. Paul Richardson for a mid-year review on myeloma and an update there. So thank you so much.
Okay, round 2. Name something that's not boring.
A laundry? Ooh, a book club. Computer solitaire, huh?
Ah, sorry, we were looking for Chumba Casino. That's right, ChumbaCasino.com has over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.